Hey everybody, we are going to go over a circulatory pathway to the head. Obviously our head is really important. It's got our brain in there, and it's important to get it constant blood supply. And so there are several ways to get blood to the head. There are several ways. So let's start here in the left ventricle. From the left ventricle we go through the aortic semilunar valve. The aorta is hiding behind the pulmonary trunk. It's here. And from here, we can go one of three directions. Let's start with this first path. This is the brachiocephalic trunk, the brachiocephalic artery hiding underneath this brachiocephalic vein. This brachiocephalic artery branches into the right subclavian and the right common carotid. This right common carotid will go up to the brain. It'll branch into external and internal carotid, and the internal carotid will go up to the brain. The subclavian will also go up to the brain. The subclavian will branch to the vertebral artery. The vertebral artery is what goes, if these are the cervical vertebrae, these are the cervical vertebrae, and here you can see the transverse foramina of these cervical vertebrae. Here is a vertebral artery going up. And yeah, this is the right vertebral artery branching from the right subclavian. It goes up and into the skull. The right vertebral artery goes in through that foramen magnum, the same hole that the spinal cord enters or exits. We'll come back to that right vertebral artery in a second. So once again, from the subclavian you can get the right vertebral artery. You've got the right common carotid, which will branch to the right internal carotid. That's another way to get up there. From here, this is the left common carotid. This middle one branching is the left common carotid, which will branch into the external and internal carotid arteries. Back to this model over here. These were the vertebral arteries. They're inside of the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebrae. But over here, this is the left common carotid artery. It's common because it then branches. This is the external carotid, which goes to the surface of the head. But we want to know more about the internal carotid. Here's the internal carotid artery. It goes up and up. Oh, there it is. Into the skull. There's the internal carotid artery. This last blood vessel coming out of the aorta, this is the left subclavian, and the left subclavian will also branch to a left vertebral artery. What we see over here, left vertebral artery, or sorry, where are you? It's hiding in there. Left vertebral artery. What's really interesting is that those left and right vertebral arteries, so here's the back of the head, posterior of the occipital part of the skull, left vertebral artery, right vertebral artery. You look at the base of the skull, so this is posterior, this is anterior. Here's left vertebral artery, right vertebral artery. They join up in the middle here. They join up. This single artery going down the midline, that's the basilar artery. That's the basilar artery. The basilar artery then branches, these two major branches here. This is the right posterior cerebral, and this is the left posterior cerebral artery. Let's go to the right for a second. From the right posterior cerebral artery, we have this tiny connection. That's the right posterior communicating artery. Posterior cerebral artery, posterior communicating artery. From the posterior communicating artery, we've got this large blood vessel. Do you remember it? See how it's going through the skull? This is, well, from this side, this is the internal carotid going through the skull, coming up here. So here's a left internal carotid. This is the right internal carotid. Posterior cerebral, posterior communicating, internal carotid. We have this branch here. This is the anterior cerebral artery, anterior cerebral artery, anterior cerebral artery on the other side. And then they connect in front here, kind of where the ethmoid and the olfactory bulbs are. This is the anterior communicating artery. We formed a circle here. This is known as the Circle of Willis. It's an example of an anastomosis for an important area here like the brain. Once again, vertebral artery, basilar artery, posterior cerebral, posterior communicating, internal carotid, anterior cerebral, anterior communicating, and mirrored on the other side too. Posterior cerebral, posterior communicating, internal carotid, anterior cerebral, and there's only one anterior communicating. You can see how the Circle of Willis is encircling where the sella turcica is, so the pituitary would be sitting right here. This nerve right here, that's representing the optic chiasm. This is representing the optic nerves coming out, continuing on to the optic tracts. Trigeminal is over here. So yeah, it's all in the mix here, in a really important area of the skull, of the brain. And yeah, so those are the arteries serving the head. Vertebral arteries that came from the subclavians, internal carotids that came from the common carotids. You've got several arteries delivering blood to the brain. To have blood empty from the brain, we actually need to go to this model over here. What I want you to know for this class is that we've seen this before. To empty blood from the brain, you've got your dural venous sinuses. Dural venous sinuses, there's several of them, but like this one along the longitudinal fissure, this one that's separating from the cerebellum to the cerebrum. These veins, dural venous sinuses, drain blood away from the head, and it'll eventually reach the superior vena cava. All right, that's how blood goes to and from the brain. Hope this helps. Thanks for watching. Let me know if you have any questions.